Hi, I'm excited to share that we have a new free bonus just for you.
We've started publishing our very own quarterly cyber risk management journal. It's loaded with over 30 pages of useful content taken directly from our podcast. Here's how we make each new edition.
So we start by transcribing the 4 or 5 episodes that we've published in the previous 3 months.
Next, we send our editor and designer the transcripts and our supporting materials for those episodes.
Then they revise all the text, they put clickable links in for all the resources, and they create the best look and feel for each episode.
And finally, we, Kip and I, make sure the finished PDF is ready for you.
So download the current edition now. All you have to do is go to b.link/CRMJ, that's the letter B, .link/CRMJ.
And if you like it, share it with your friends and encourage them to subscribe to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Now, on with the show.
Welcome to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Our mission is to help you thrive as a cyber risk manager. On today's episode, your virtual Chief Information Security Officer is Kip Boyle, and your virtual Cybersecurity Counsel is Jake Bernstein. Visit them at cyberriskopportunities.com and focallaw.com.
So, Kip, what are we going to talk about today?
Hey, Jake, welcome back from vacation. Today, we're going to talk about cyber exploitation through supply chains, and we're going to do that with the help of our guest, Stephen Carnovale, who is the Assistant Professor of Supply Chain Management at the Rochester Institute of Technology.
Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
We're glad you're here.
A supply chain sounds like a lot of boxes in a dusty warehouse being moved around with a forklift. But I'm guessing that's not quite right, is it? Can you go ahead and tell us what it is?
Yeah, well, boxes and forklifts are definitely involved, but generally what we're talking about when we talk about supply chains and the management of supply chains it's a couple different things. So it's everything, all of the processes involved with sourcing, manufacturing, storing, distributing, and then when products come back, the returning of those products. So you can take any product you want, a cell phone, a cup of coffee, a notebook, it doesn't matter. And if we think about everything that goes into it, you take a cell phone, for example, it's a really good one. These new cell phones right now, if you were to tear them apart, they've got 12 or 13 different subcomponents on their bill of materials, right? You've got the screen, and you've got the processor and the battery. Well, when you pull them apart, they come from, if there's 13, there's probably 11 different countries involved. And the volume that they're producing them in, they're able to drive the cost down exceedingly low, working with multiple suppliers from all around the world, procuring the requisite amount of materials, shipping them to the place where they need to be assembled, storing them, packaging them, and then meeting the demand on the customer side of things so that you and I can walk into any store and get the product that we need. And, cell phones, like I said, anything. So that's what we mean by supply chains. It's everything involved from A to B.
And supply chains aren't just physical goods, right? There's digital goods in a supply chain too, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and, it's relevant to the topic we're talking about today. But if you think about the cloud computing infrastructure, it's kind of like a gradient or a continuum, right? There's a certain degree of how much of something is a pure product and how much of something is a pure service. And so if you look at a service supply chain there, what you're talking about are the pieces of infrastructure involved in supporting the delivery of whatever that service is. So if it's something like an amusement park, right, there's a whole ton of process involved with getting everything ready. And in the service side of things, really what we're focused on, managing capacity. So with cloud computing, the thing that we focus the most on there, bandwidth and storage and access and all these kind of things. Well, there's a whole supply chain that goes into, of course, assembling the data centers and things like that. But there's also all of the processes involved and the coordination of everything so that, ultimately that service can be delivered successfully.
Yeah, and that includes software as a service. So I'm reminded of the 2017 NotPetya cyber episode where it kind of came down to a tax software preparation program that was, had a supply chain of its own, right? I mean, you would buy this thing, install it, and then you would tell the publisher, hey, I'm a user of your service. Please send me updates, right? And so you get these monthly updates. It's kind of like in the United States, you might get TurboTax or something like that. And you get these updates, and it just so happens that somebody compromised the updates and delivered a piece of malicious code. And so I just wanted to, broaden people's perspective on what a supply chain is, just by having, this preamble here. And, a lot of bad things happen, whether you're talking about a physical good or digital good, right? There's a lot of risk, in these supply chains. Now, what we know, right, based on that actual exploit, plus many more, is that supply chains are one of the primary paths through which cyber breaches occur, even in physical goods supply chains. But Stephen, why are supply chains such a popular target?
So, in my estimation, it's the expansiveness of supply bases in general. So, what I mean by that is, I used a cell phone example before. Many of these original equipment manufacturers who produce cell phones, they work with so many different suppliers. It's not unprecedented to see 2, 3, 4, 5, 600 different suppliers. I think, in fact, Apple on their website, they say that 95 or 99% of all the products that they bring in to produce come from about 200 different suppliers. So imagine that for a minute. I'm coordinating a global organization responsible for products and services to be delivered globally, and I'm working with 200 different suppliers. Now I have to manage the relationships, the contracts, and everything with those 200 different suppliers. And so that's a kind of a small number. I think, car companies, General Motors, for example, probably has in excess of 2,500 suppliers with whom they work, right? So,
or aerospace, right? Airplane manufacturers.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, absolutely. So why are the supply chains the primary mechanism? Well, if I want to get a job, I post on LinkedIn, hey guys, I'm looking for a job if anybody helps me. And I have a friend of a friend who knows somebody who could maybe hire me. So that person kind of brokers the relationship between me and whatever company. Well, the same is true, I think, for the more insidious nature of cybercrime, right? If I'm looking at a situation, a firm, that potentially lucrative opportunity if I'm a criminal, why not go in through the back door? And the example that comes to mind is Target. So back when Target had their cyber breach, it was,
and I feel bad for their name, by the way, in this case.
right. Bullseye Incorporated. No, but
Acme, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Sign on their back.
Yeah, with the Roadrunner coming after them. No, but when Target had their cyber breach, it was an HVAC supplier in central Pennsylvania. And as I recall the story being told to me and having read it, this supplier didn't take the necessary precautions to buttress themselves against cyber crimes. And so what happened was this supplier worked with a local store in order to fix some of the ductwork in the building. The company, the HVAC supplier, got brought into Target's ERP system for payment. And when the cyber criminals, they literally went in through the back door. They got into this company, and then they went into Target, and then several hundred millions of dollars were taken. And so that's one small example, but you can take a look at any of the breaches that you guys focus on. I mean, Visa or any hotel chain. It's all through, if I'm going to be devious, I'm not going to be devious to your face very likely. I'm going to try to do it behind your back. And so that's the reason I think why supply chains are they're just ripe for the picking, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think this is an industry-wide, or it's a problem across all industries. I'm thinking right now, for example, of the cybersecurity maturity model certification, which is a new program in the American Defense Department, and the whole reason for them to spin up this new cybersecurity program is because the cyber defenses of the military networks and of the prime contractor networks are pretty good. And so the cyber attackers have been working their way down the supply chain, the logistics chain, and they found that it's much easier to gather sensitive but unclassified information from smaller contractors and subs to subs to subs. And once you aggregate enough of this sensitive, unclassified data, you can start to put together a picture of highly sensitive to top secret and beyond activities. So just another example of how these cyber attackers are leveraging supply chain to get where they want to go, even though we're hardening them. It's a never ending process, right, Jake?
It is, exactly. And speaking of hardening, external shocks such as COVID-19 have really exposed the degree to which the supply chains are so crucial to, as we've been saying, everything in the modern world. What can we learn from these types of kind of worldwide systemic shocks about how cyber criminals can exploit supply chain vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think so this is part of, in my estimation, a broader conversation about supply chain risk management. And so generally, I think what we talk about in that realm, we talk about three very big things. We talk about detection, mitigation, and recovery. So pulling it back to cyber, the detection piece, what we saw with COVID-19 when it hit supply chains, everybody talks about the toilet paper shortage, but really it's like a smoke and mirrors kind of thing, right? It's if I'm distracted with putting out a fire here and a fire there and a fire there, well, this seems like the perfect time that a company wouldn't necessarily be working or be focusing on a phishing scam.
Yeah.
Or they wouldn't be focusing on even a more direct, brute force attack on getting access to confidential and proprietary data on a server. All of these other sort of things come up during these pandemics. And so talking about a detection or even a mitigation kind of viewpoint, and I think, Kip, you talk a lot about this, how can we protect ourselves with liability insurance? How can we do the right thing ahead of time so that when it does happen, because it's not an if, it's more of a when, how can we protect ourselves? Yeah. And so where they exploit these vulnerabilities, they wait till everyone's distracted. They go into, like we talked about, this broad supply base, and basically their job is to find and exploit these opportunities. So that's what they're doing every single day. So if we're focused on other things and we're not paying attention to the best practices to ensure that these things don't happen, I think, any shock to the supply chain, or even forget the supply chains for a minute, generalize it, any external shock that would distract our attention away from things that aren't right in front of our face present an opportunity for these folks to come in and unfortunately do what they do best.
Yeah, and I think you're also putting your finger on something that is important in general, which is logistics, right? Which is the the discipline around supply chains have done amazing things for the world that we live in. I mean, just in time delivery of parts and products and that sort of thing have created all these economies, all these savings. But when the supply chains aren't working for whatever reason, then that's when you start, seeing shortages. So I think it's, I just thought it was interesting to see, what kinds of shortages of products were being created during the pandemic and the quarantines. And I was kind of surprised at some things and not surprised at other things. For example, webcams. Just go try to buy a decent webcam. I mean, yep. It's really hard because of of what happened. And I remember discussing with a couple of my customers about what they should expect. What it looked like the quarantine was happening. We started brainstorming, and we came up with laptops, smartphones. Everything that was going to go into high demand because of a sudden need to work from home. And the supply chains weren't ready for that. I mean, because they have such long lead times, right? I mean, you're like 6, 12, 18 months of pre-planning in order to make those things flow well. So they're susceptible to unforeseen major changes like COVID-19 or like a cyber attack.
Absolutely. So you touched on two things that are interesting that I want to bring up. The first is there's a very predictable sequence of things being in high demand. So at the beginning of the pandemic, what ended up happening, aside from the toilet paper, which was just really nonsensical, what ended up happening was rice, canned goods, peanut butter, things like that. People were preparing their pantries for potential shocks to the food system. And then after about a month of the shutdown and quarantine, the Walmart CEO, I think, described it as the clipper and dye phase, because people were getting shaggy and they needed to trim their hair. Yeah. And so
and darken their hair.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just losing mine. So, darkening isn't really an issue at this point.
Oh, I mowed mine under years ago.
So then what's next, right? Then you see jigsaw puzzles were another thing that were spiked in demand because people are just losing their minds and they're really bored. And then home improvement stores and then. So part of this has to do with human behavior. The reason why these shocks end up hitting supply chains and why we as consumers end up feeling them is that this is a system which is very precisely calibrated, and it does allow for a buffer. But the buffer that we're seeing with the COVID, it's a black swan. It's this unforeseen, crazy, unlikely event that happened that has rippling and cascading effects. So that's the first thing. The second thing that's really interesting, and you talked about, supply chains and the improvements that they make to people's lives. This also presents kind of an interesting and really insidious cyber threat opportunity. So the Internet of Things, IoT, being deployed into supply chains is really crazy. And it's awesome on the one sense because,
it's unlocking a lot of value.
Oh, tremendous value. If I'm shipping fresh produce from California to New York and I put a tracker inside, an internet-connected tracker inside my freight, and it can sense the temperature, the amount of, the gas that the fruit kicks off, and it can send a signal to the cab that says, hey, guys, we need to pull over or vent it or do something, right? We need to make a correction here because the produce is going to go bad. And then you think about all of the other IoT stuff that's being deployed throughout the supply chain. Well, what if I'm a competitor and I have no scruples and I implore someone to hack into those sensors and say, nah, everything's fine, don't worry about it. And then you arrive in New York and you have a whole rotted truck of produce, right?
Well, that's the Stuxnet of the vegetable supply chain, right?
Yeah, and then so you take that and then you combine it with the impact that COVID had shutting down plants because workers were getting infected. And, it's this confluence of events. So, to kind of recap on the original question, the vulnerabilities are everywhere, but I think the best practices are still pretty clear. It's just a matter of having finite resources being able to deal with, those things which are important, right?
Another thing that cyber criminals are going after with respect to supply chains is payments, right? I mean, business email compromise is a perfect example of how somebody is looking at a supply chain and saying, okay, this company delivered services to that company. So A did something for B. Now B has to pay A. Right. So it's like, cool. Now I can jump in and impersonate A or impersonate B or just get in the middle somehow and redirect the payments, and so it's interesting how so much of the cybercrime that we're seeing can be tied back to supply chain.
Oh, yeah. And the thing of it, too, and what I think you echoed previously, and actually a colleague of mine has an article about this. It's in a Harvard Business Review. If any of your listeners are interested, I can provide them the details. But what firms should do when they're dealing with these big supply bases, this opportunity for theft, I mean, things like putting cybersecurity explicitly into the contract while you're doing the procurement, or requiring or mitigating or at least governing the access that these suppliers have to your IT systems, right? I mean, there's some relatively straightforward stuff.
And Jake's all over this. Jake is all over this, right? I mean, Jake has a whole approach. Why don't you share, a thumbnail sketch of your approach for this, Jake?
So what I do is I like to have different tiers of master service agreements depending upon the level of access that a vendor has to the client's information systems. And basically, the idea is I kind of borrow the confidential, secret, top secret nomenclature from the government, and then I go backwards and basically define, if this vendor were to be hacked or to release data, what is the level of harm that could result from that? And that's actually how the government defines confidential, secret, and top secret. And so that in a very short nutshell, that's the approach I take. And what we do is we deploy tier 3 master services agreements for anyone who has certainly the keys to the kingdom, or has constant access to customer or client files and systems. And that would be your cloud service providers, your IT contractors, anyone who I would say is just business critical on the infrastructure side. And then your tier 1 on the opposite end would be the water company that comes and delivers the bottles of water. They don't probably have any access.
Changes the floor mats.
They don't need to have any kind of real strict cybersecurity provisions in their contract. So, it's a lot of companies try to make do with one size fits all contracts, and honestly, it's such I think you actually save time and money if you don't attempt to make one size fit all, and that's the approach I take in a nutshell.
So, do you, as part of that? So that's kind of a governance mechanism from the firm to their suppliers. Are there teeth on the back end of that, for example, where let's say the person who was responsible for coordinating that contract and the pricing and everything, if something got by that person, are they held accountable? Because that's another thing that I think is probably important too, right? It's a two-sided thing.
It is. I mean, that's a really interesting question. And I think currently most of the accountability is going to be on the vendor side, because my clients are usually not coming to me for internal management issues. These are usually external facing contracts, which is what that is. But I do think that is a really important component of a vendor risk management or a third party supply chain risk management program, which is internal accountability. I think that's
that's really my territory, right? As a chief information security officer, I'm looking internally and I'm asking myself, does everybody understand their role? Cybersecurity is a team sport. So does everybody know their position? Does everybody know what they need to do? Sports analogies are wonderful because the team can't win, right, if the kicker can't get the ball through the uprights, right? I mean, it's like, everybody's got to do their part. And so if you've got somebody who's miscategorizing vendors and giving them tier 1 contracts with, very few requirements and consequences, but they're actually performing like a tier 3 vendor, then I've got an errors and training problem. And, and that can undo the best systems, is internal people not doing the right things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way to just kind of show that it's such a interconnected, much like the supply chain itself. Even managing your supply chain is a very interconnected process and concept that has to really be done carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in this world that we live in, right? I mean, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you might have gotten away with having one MSA, and that was perfectly fine. Senior decision makers right now were kind of brought up in that world, and they may not realize that the world's changed, and they have to evolve their approach. They have to become more sophisticated. We actually see that a lot in a lot of different areas, but I don't want to stray too far from supply chain, Stephen, because you're the guest.
Hey, I'm just along for the ride. This is cool just to listen. That's all.
So, okay, but this is such an important topic, and I think we've kind of made that case. I hope we have. And if anybody doesn't feel like we have in the audience, send us a message and tell us what we missed. But Stephen, you're writing a book, and it's called Cybersecurity and Supply Chain Management: Risks, Challenges, and Solutions. Why did you want to write that book?
Well, I think Jake alluded to it where he noted how interdisciplinary and how interconnected everything that we've been discussing is, right? So you talk about cybersecurity and several camps could come and say, no, we own that. We own cybersecurity. But as you said, Kip, it's a team sport. So I wanted to kind of, myself and my co-editor of the book, we kind of wanted to advocate a couple different things. First, what on earth is the connection between the two? Because on the face of it, it does require a little thought to say, is this really a supply chain thing? And then once you start talking about it, you at least come to the conclusion that it has supply chain implications and vulnerabilities. So, we wanted to communicate the fact that supply chains need to think about this, particularly because they're the ones responsible for procurement, for purchasing, be it products, be it services, whatever the case is. So we wanted to do that. And we also kind of wanted to advocate a little bit about grounding the idea of what it is. And in the book itself, which is coming out soon, the book kind of weaves together academic information and a little bit more formal exposition of what the topic is, why it's important, how to think about it. And then it weaves in a more practical standpoint of, so what? It's great that I can sit here and pontificate. I do it for a living, but what are we going to do about it? And so, the book has a lot of different things. It has some unique perspectives about cyber in manufacturing using different QR codes for hedging risk. It has some things about human beings, people operating within the supply chain, being kind of like the first line of defense. It has some case studies about issues that have gone wrong, and for people reading it saying, gee, how can I think about buttressing my own defenses? So it's shaping up to be a pretty great book. And the net of it is I wanted to craft a contribution and kind of put my flag in the sand that says, let's start thinking about this. It's an important topic. And as you said, Kip, it's a team sport, and the supply chain is a big part of that team.
Yeah, so your book could be one of the playbooks, right, that our senior decision makers could be using in order to know, what positions people should be playing, and and how they should be contributing. But who's the target audience? I mean, senior decision makers, practitioners. What would you say? Other people?
I would say, we kind of straddle the unique line in between having it be academically rigorous but practically relevant. And so I think, and I hope, senior decision makers could certainly take this and glance at the chapters that would be relevant to them, perhaps the case studies and kind of the more executive perspectives on it. And then I think probably academics working in this area doing research to kind of ground it more theoretically, they could look at it and hopefully get ideas for work that could end up ultimately helping those senior decision makers in future books. So, I think it's definitely not going to be a page turner like a spy thriller, but it ought to be helpful for many different people operating in this area. And ultimately, really what I hope is that it kind of just makes the connection and grounds formally the connection between the supply chain and cybersecurity.
I like it.
Thank you.
Yeah, me too. Very, very interesting.
So, actually, I kind of liked Stephen's idea so much that I guess he must have sensed that, because he actually asked me to write a chapter of his book. So I did that, and it's turned in.
And what was it about?
Well, so Stephen invited me to write about the executive perspective on supply chain management, which was easy for me because I talk about the senior decision maker's role in cybersecurity all the time. So for me, it was just a matter of reining myself in and confining my comments to supply chain. but it actually wasn't that tough because as I think we've heard in the episode today, supply chain is it's pervasive. And so it's really not hard to connect just about anything cyber risk related to it. But yeah. Anyway, so that just about wraps up our episode today. Jake, did you have any final thoughts or comments or questions for Stephen?
I think you're absolutely correct, Stephen, that this is a critical component. It probably isn't studied enough. So I'm really glad to hear that you're working on this and getting the information out there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thanks for letting me chat about it for a little bit. All the contributions were great, and Kip's chapter was very well received. And I think in particular for those senior decision makers looking to make the connection, Kip's chapter is going to be quite a good one.
Well, Stephen, we're really glad you are our guest today. Where can people learn more about you and your work? Do you have a website, an email address, or would you rather remain difficult to find?
No, I don't think I'm too difficult to find. For an email address, if you want to contact me, it's Carnovale, that's CARN as in Nancy, OV as in Victor, ALE, at saunders.rit.edu. And if you Google my name, Stephen Carnovale, Rochester Institute of Technology, my faculty page will pop up and things like that. So, and I can provide you with all that info. So feel free to reach out and we can chat about this or anything else you deem quasi-relevant.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us today, Stephen.
Great. Thank you guys for having me.
Okay, that wraps up this episode of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. And today we discussed cyber exploitation through supply chains. And we did that with the help of our guest, Stephen Carnovale. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Remember that cyber risk management is a team sport, so include your senior decision makers, legal department, HR, and IT for full effectiveness. So, if you want to manage cyber as the dynamic business risk it has become, we can help. Find out more by visiting us at cyberriskopportunities.com and focallaw.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.